The grand concert hall was packed that evening. Every seat was filled with people dressed in their finest clothes, waiting for something extraordinary to happen. The air buzzed with quiet conversations and the rustling of programs. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over everything below. This wasn't just any concert. This was the International Piano Competition, an event that happened only once a year and drew the best piano players from every corner of the world. At the front of the hall stood a magnificent black piano, so polished that it reflected the lights above like a mirror. Behind it, heavy velvet curtains framed the stage. In the audience sat musicians, music teachers, critics, and people who simply loved beautiful music. Everyone was here for one reason: to witness history. But there was something different about this year's competition, something that had everyone on edge. A famous composer had written a new piece of music and he'd brought it to the competition as a challenge. The composer was an older man with silver hair and kind eyes, someone who had spent his entire life creating beautiful melodies. He'd written symphonies that made people cry and concertos that made them want to dance. His music had been played in the finest halls across Europe, Asia, and America. When he spoke about music, even the most accomplished musicians leaned in to listen. 3 months earlier, he'd announced his newest creation. He called it Rhapsody in Fragments, and from the moment he revealed it to the world, it caused a stir in the music community. The piece was different from anything he'd written before. It was bold, complex, and according to those who'd seen the sheet music, nearly impossible to play. The first 4 movements were challenging, but manageable for a skilled pianist. They flowed with the kind of beauty people expected from this composer. But then came the 5th and final section, and that's where everything changed. The last 12 measures of the piece contained something unusual, something that had never been done before in classical music. It was written like a puzzle, with notation that seemed to shift and change depending on how you looked at it. The pianist had to figure out the correct pattern from what seemed like thousands of possible combinations, and then execute it perfectly. Music journalists had written articles calling it the unplayable piece. Some said the composer had gone too far, that he'd created something more like a math problem than music. Others defended it as genius, arguing that music should push boundaries and challenge what people thought was possible. Now at the competition, everyone would see for themselves whether the piece could actually be performed. The preliminary rounds had started 2 hours ago. One by one, pianists took the stage. These weren't beginners or amateurs. These were people who had dedicated their entire lives to mastering their craft. There was a woman from Russia who'd won competitions in Moscow and St. Petersburg, a man from Japan who could play Chopin so beautifully that audiences often wept, a young musician from Brazil whose fingers moved across the keys faster than most people could follow. Each of them had chosen to attempt Rhapsody in Fragments as their competition piece. It was a risk, everyone knew that, but if someone could actually finish it, could actually solve the puzzle and play those final measures correctly, they would be guaranteed to win. They would go down in history. The Russian pianist went first. She sat at the piano with perfect posture, her hands hovering over the keys for a moment before she began. The opening notes filled the hall, delicate and precise. She moved through the first movement with ease, her years of training evident in every phrase. The audience leaned forward in their seats. The second movement came, then the third. Everything was perfect. Her technique was flawless. The music swelled and softened exactly as the composer had intended. Then came the final section. Her fingers began the complex pattern, moving confidently at first. But within seconds, something went wrong. Her hands hesitated. She tried one combination of notes, then another. Nothing sounded right. The music that had been so beautiful moments before turned disjointed and harsh. She kept trying, her face growing tense with concentration. After a painful minute, she lifted her hands from the keys and stood. The audience applauded politely, but everyone knew what they'd witnessed. She hadn't finished. The Japanese pianist was next. He approached the piano with calm determination. His performance of the first 4 movements was even more impressive than the first pianist's. He played with such emotion that some people in the audience closed their eyes just to listen. Surely if anyone could solve the puzzle, it would be him. But when he reached those final 12 measures, the same thing happened. His fingers stumbled over the keys. The pattern that had seemed so clear in his mind dissolved into confusion. The notes clashed against each other. After several attempts, he too had to stop, his shoulders sagging with disappointment. This pattern repeated through the afternoon and into the evening. 8 pianists, 10, 15, each one delivered a breathtaking performance right up until the final section. And each one failed to finish. Some came closer than others, managing to play a few measures of the puzzle before losing their way, but none could complete it. The composer sat in the front row with the other judges, watching each attempt. With every failure, his expression grew heavier. He'd been so sure someone would solve it. He'd tested the piece himself dozens of times while writing it. The solution was there, hidden in the notation like a secret waiting to be discovered. But watching these incredibly talented musicians struggle, he began to doubt himself. Maybe the critics were right. Maybe he had pushed too far. Maybe some boundaries existed for a reason. The audience's mood shifted as the competition wore on. At first, people had been excited, eager to see if someone would succeed. Now a somber feeling settled over the hall. It was hard to watch such talented people fail at something they'd worked so hard to master. Between performances, people whispered to each other. Some debated the merits of the piece. Others wondered if perhaps the composer had made an error in the notation itself. If maybe the puzzle simply had no solution. As the 19th pianist finished her attempt and walked off stage, her head down, the murmuring in the audience grew louder. The competition organizers huddled together, discussing what to do. This had never happened before. Usually, by this point in the competition, several pianists had delivered complete stunning performances. Now they had 19 partial performances and growing frustration throughout the hall. The composer stood and made his way backstage, needing a moment alone. He found a quiet corner and sat down heavily in a chair. All his life, he'd believed that music should challenge people, should make them reach higher. But what was the point of a challenge that no one could meet? What was the point of creating something beautiful if it could never actually be heard the way he'd intended? The evening shadows grew longer outside the tall windows of the concert hall. The competition would have to end soon, and it seemed certain now that Rhapsody in Fragments would remain unfinished, a beautiful puzzle with no solution, at least not one that human hands could play. While the competition continued on stage, something very different was happening in the back rows of the concert hall. Far from the spotlight and the nervous energy of the performers, a young girl sat quietly next to her mother. She was only 7 years old, small for her age, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. In her arms, she held a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. The rabbit's fur was matted in places. One ear was slightly torn, and it had been washed so many times that its original bright color had faded to a soft gray. The girl's mother worked at the concert hall, not as a musician or a teacher, but as a custodian. Every evening after the crowds left, she would mop the floors, wipe down the seats, and make sure everything was perfect for the next day's events. It was honest work, but it was tiring and it didn't pay much. Today there had been no school because of a teacher's meeting, and her mother couldn't afford a babysitter. So the girl had come to work with her as she sometimes did. Her mother had given her strict instructions. Sit quietly in the back. Don't disturb anyone. Don't touch anything. The girl was good at following rules. She'd brought her stuffed rabbit and a small book about animals, thinking she would read while her mother prepared for the cleaning that would happen after the competition ended. But then the music started, and the girl forgot all about her book. She had never heard anything like it. The piano's sound filled the enormous hall, reaching even to the back row where she sat. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest feel tight. She didn't know the names of the notes or understand music theory. Her family couldn't afford piano lessons. Once she'd asked about learning to play, and her mother had gotten that sad look in her eyes, the one that meant, maybe someday, but not now. Still, even without training, the girl heard something in the music that others might have missed. She'd always been like this ever since she was very small. She noticed patterns everywhere. The way rain fell on windows created rhythms. The beeping of crosswalk signals followed predictable sequences. Even the way birds sang in the morning had a structure to it, like they were having conversations that followed rules only they understood. When the first pianist began playing the composer's difficult piece, the girl set down her book completely. She clutched her rabbit and listened with total focus. The music flowed like water, smooth and clear. Then suddenly, near the end, it stumbled. The beautiful pattern broke apart into scattered sounds that didn't fit together. The girl frowned. That wasn't right. She could feel it wasn't right even though she couldn't explain why. The second pianist played. The same thing happened. Beautiful music, then confusion at the end. The girl leaned forward in her seat, ignoring her mother's gentle tug to sit back properly. Something was bothering her about what she was hearing, like an itch she couldn't quite reach. By the fifth or sixth performance, the girl understood what was wrong. Well, not wrong exactly. The pianists were playing what they saw on the paper, but they were missing something. They were thinking too hard, trying too many complicated solutions. The answer was actually simple. She could hear it in her head as clearly as if someone was whispering it to her. "Mama," she said quietly, tugging on her mother's sleeve. Her mother was going over her cleaning schedule, trying to figure out what time she'd be able to finish tonight with the competition running so long. "Not now, sweetheart. Mama's working." "But Mama, they're playing it wrong." Her mother glanced at her daughter with a tired smile. The girl was always saying things like this, pointing out patterns and everything. Last week, she'd spent an hour explaining how the tiles on their kitchen floor created a mathematical sequence. Her mother loved her daughter's curious mind, but sometimes she wished the girl would just be quiet and let her focus. "I'm sure they're playing it correctly. These are very important musicians." "But they're not," the girl insisted, her voice still barely above a whisper. She didn't want to be disrespectful or draw attention, but she needed someone to understand. The ending isn't complicated. It's just a circle that folds into itself. Her mother nodded absently, not really listening. She patted her daughter's hand and went back to her schedule. The girl sighed and hugged her rabbit tighter. Adults never listened. They always thought things were more complicated than they actually were. She watched more pianists take the stage. Each time she silently played along in her mind, her fingers twitching slightly against her rabbit's worn fur. When each pianist reached the puzzle section, she wanted to call out, to tell them they were going the wrong way. It was like watching someone try to open a door by pushing when they should pull. The solution was right there, so obvious to her, but no one could see it. The girl's mother eventually stood up, needing to check on something backstage. She told her daughter to stay in her seat and not move. The girl nodded, but her attention never left the stage. Another pianist was performing now. A tall man who played with such skill that people in the audience were recording on their phones. But the girl knew what would happen. She'd heard the pattern 19 times now. She knew exactly where he would stumble. Sure enough, when he reached the final section, his hands faltered. The music broke apart. The girl felt a wave of frustration wash over her. Why couldn't anyone hear it? The pattern was so clear. It reminded her of the spiral shell she'd seen at the museum once during a school field trip. The way it curved around and around, each section related to the one before it. That's what the music was doing. Each note connected to the previous ones in a specific way, creating a spiral of sound that curved back to the beginning. She looked down at her rabbit. On one of its ears there was embroidered pattern, a spiral design that her grandmother had stitched years ago before she passed away. The girl traced it with her finger, following the curve around and around. That's what the music needed to do. That's what all these pianists were missing. The competition was starting to feel heavy now. The excitement from earlier had turned into something sadder. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some were leaving, deciding they'd seen enough. The girl heard bits of conversations floating back to where she sat. Such a shame. Maybe the piece really is impossible. I feel bad for them. Trying so hard and failing. The girl didn't think it was a shame. She thought it was frustrating. The answer was right there, like a word on the tip of your tongue. These musicians had spent years learning to play. They knew so much more than she did about music. But sometimes knowing too much made you miss simple things. Sometimes you got so caught up in complex solutions that you forgot to look for easy ones. Her mother returned and sat down with a heavy sigh. It was getting late and the competition showed no signs of ending successfully. The composer had even walked off stage looking defeated. The girl wanted to say something again, but she'd learned that adults dismissed children's ideas, especially when the adults were stressed or tired. So she sat quietly, her fingers still moving against her rabbit's fur, playing the solution in her mind over and over. The pattern was so pretty when you played it right. It sounded like water flowing in a circle, or wind moving through trees, returning to where it started but somehow different, changed by the journey. She didn't know that in just a little while everything would change. She didn't know that her moment was coming, that soon she wouldn't be just a quiet girl in the back row anymore. For now, she simply held her rabbit and listened, waiting for something she couldn't name, feeling the pattern pulse through her mind like a heartbeat, steady and sure. The composer returned to the stage looking older than he had just hours before. The bright light seemed harsh on his face, showing every line of worry and disappointment. He walked slowly to the microphone, adjusting it with trembling hands. The audience fell silent, sensing that something important was about to be announced. He cleared his throat and began to speak. His voice, usually strong and confident, now carried the weight of defeat. He thanked everyone for coming, thanked the pianists for their courage in attempting his composition. Then he said the words that made the entire audience murmur in surprise. "I regret to inform you that we will not be naming a winner this year." The hall erupted in whispers. This had never happened before in the competition's 50-year history. There was always a winner. Always someone who rose above the rest and claimed the prize. The composer continued, his eyes downcast. "My piece has proven to be beyond what I intended. Perhaps I was too ambitious. Perhaps I forgot that music should bring joy, not frustration." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "However, I want to give one final opportunity. The stage will remain open for another hour. Anyone who wishes to attempt the piece may do so. You don't need to be a registered competitor. You don't need credentials or awards. If you believe you can solve what these masters could not, please come forward." It was an unusual offer, almost desperate. The audience stirred with mixed reactions. Some pianists left immediately, not wanting to risk further embarrassment. A few remained in their seats, considering whether to try again. Others stayed simply because they were curious to see what would happen. The girl in the back row sat up straighter. Her heart began beating faster, though she couldn't explain why. Her mother was gathering her things, getting ready to start the cleaning work once the hall emptied. The competition was essentially over. Time to get to work. But the girl couldn't stop thinking about that pattern, about the spiral, about how simple the solution really was. She looked at her rabbit, at the spiral stitched on its ear. Then she looked at the stage, at the beautiful black piano sitting there under the lights, waiting. What would happen if she tried? Would they laugh at her? Would they be angry that a child interrupted their important event? She was just a custodian's daughter. She'd never taken a lesson. She didn't even know if she could reach the pedals properly, but she knew the pattern. She could feel it in her bones. Her mother stood up, slinging her cleaning supply bag over her shoulder. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's wait in the back until everyone leaves." The girl didn't move. She watched as a few people milled around near the stage, talking in low voices. The composer stood off to the side, looking like he wanted to disappear. One pianist, a woman who hadn't performed yet, approached the piano. Maybe she would try. Maybe she would see what the girl saw. The woman sat down and began to play. Her technique was flawless. The notes rang out clear and pure. The girl listened hopefully. But when the final section came, the same thing happened. Confusion, discord, the pattern breaking apart instead of spiraling inward. The woman stopped, shook her head, and walked away. Something inside the girl's chest felt like it was pulling her forward. It was the same feeling she got when she saw a puzzle with a missing piece, or when she noticed that a picture frame was hanging crooked. Something needed to be fixed, and she knew how to fix it. Before she could think too much about it, before fear could stop her, the girl stood up. She clutched her rabbit to her chest and stepped into the aisle. Her mother, who had been adjusting her cleaning supplies, suddenly noticed her daughter moving. "Where are you going?" "Come back here," but the girl kept walking. Her feet carried her down the aisle, past the rows of seats toward the stage. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. What was she doing? This was crazy. She was nobody, just a kid with a worn-out stuffed animal. But the pattern, she had to play the pattern. People started noticing her as she reached the front of the hall, a small figure in a faded dress carrying a stuffed rabbit heading toward the stage. Some smiled, thinking she was lost. Others looked concerned. A few laughed quietly, assuming this was some kind of mistake. The girl climbed the stairs to the stage. Each step felt huge, like climbing a mountain. The stage lights were so bright. The piano looked enormous from up here, bigger than it had seemed from the back row. She could see the audience now, all those faces looking at her with confusion and curiosity. The composer noticed her and quickly walked over. He knelt down to be at her eye level, his expression kind but worried. Hello there. Are you looking for someone? Are you lost? The girl shook her head. Her mouth felt dry. She wanted to run back to her mother to forget this silly idea. But the pattern was still there in her mind, pulsing and clear. May I try? Her voice came out so quietly she wasn't sure he heard her. The composer blinked in surprise. Try what, dear? She pointed at the piano, at the sheet music still resting on its stand. The song. May I try to play it? The hall went completely silent. Everyone was watching now. The composer looked at this tiny girl with her stuffed rabbit and worn dress. He glanced back at the other judges who shrugged, clearly as bewildered as he was. Something in the girl's eyes made him pause. There was a certainty there, a quiet confidence that seemed out of place in someone so young. He thought about his announcement. Anyone could try. He'd said that and he'd meant it. Even if this seemed absurd, even if this girl obviously couldn't play a piece that had defeated the world's best pianists, he'd given his word. Besides, what harm could it do? The competition was already over. Let the child have her moment even if it ended in disappointment. All right, he said softly, stepping aside. Go ahead. The girl walked to the piano bench. She set her rabbit carefully on top of the piano, positioning it so it could watch her. The rabbit sat there, its spiral-stitched ear visible to anyone looking closely. Then she climbed onto the bench. It was too high and her feet dangled well above the pedals. She wouldn't be able to use them, but somehow she knew she didn't need to. This piece wasn't about force or technical tricks. It was about the pattern. Her mother had reached the front of the hall now, looking mortified. She called out softly, "Sweetheart, come down from there. Don't bother these people." But the girl wasn't listening. She was looking at the sheet music, her eyes moving across the notes. In her mind, everything clicked into place. She could see it now, written right there on the paper. The spiral. The way each note connected to the ones before it, creating a mathematical sequence that curved back on itself. It was beautiful. It was simple. It was right there for anyone to see if only they looked at it the right way. She placed her small fingers on the keys. They felt cool and smooth under her touch. The entire concert hall held its breath. Hundreds of people watched this impossible scene. A 7-year-old girl who'd never had a lesson, sitting at a piano that had defeated masters, about to attempt the impossible. The composer stood frozen a few feet away, not sure whether to stop this or let it continue. The judges whispered to each other. The audience leaned forward in their seats. The girl's mother covered her mouth with her hand, torn between pride at her daughter's courage and fear of the humiliation that seemed inevitable. The girl closed her eyes for just a moment. She thought of her grandmother's spiral stitching. She thought of the shell at the museum. She thought of how water moves in circles, always returning to where it started. Then she began to play. The first notes that came from the piano were soft but clear. Not hesitant, not fumbling, but gentle and sure. The girl's small fingers moved across the keys with a lightness that seemed natural, as if she'd done this 1,000 times before. The opening melody filled the concert hall. People who had been whispering fell silent. The composer, who had been about to step forward and gently stop this, froze where he stood. The girl's mother, standing near the front row with her cleaning supplies still over her shoulder, felt tears spring to her eyes, though she didn't understand why. The music was beautiful. Not just technically correct, but truly beautiful in a way that made you forget to breathe. The girl swayed slightly as she played, her body moving with the rhythm. Her feet still dangled above the pedals, swinging gently back and forth in time with the notes. She didn't need the pedals. The music flowed from her fingers as if it had always been there, just waiting for the right person to release it. She moved through the first movement, then into the second. Her small hands stretched to reach the wider chords, but she managed them all. Some people in the audience pulled out their phones, beginning to record this impossible moment. Others simply watched, afraid that if they moved or made a sound, they might break whatever magic was happening on that stage. The composer took a step closer, his eyes wide with disbelief. He knew his own composition better than anyone. He'd written every note, agonized over every measure. And this child, this little girl who couldn't possibly have studied his work, was playing it exactly as he'd heard it in his mind when he'd first created it. The third movement came, more complex than the first two. The girl's fingers danced across the keys, never hesitating, never searching for the right notes, It was as if the piano was simply an extension of her thoughts, translating directly from her mind to sound without any barrier in between. Her mother had moved closer now, standing at the edge of the stage. She was crying openly, one hand pressed to her heart. She'd known her daughter was special, had seen the way she noticed patterns in everything. But this? She'd never imagined this. The fourth movement built towards something bigger. The music grew more intense, more emotional. People in the audience were leaning forward in their seats now, completely captivated. Several were crying, though they couldn't explain why. There was something about hearing a child play with such purity, such complete understanding that touched something deep inside. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The moment where every other pianist had failed. The impossible section, the puzzle that had no solution. The girl didn't pause. She didn't tense up or show any sign of worry. Her fingers simply continued moving, flowing right into the final section as naturally as water flowing downhill, and then something remarkable happened. The notes that had sounded harsh and wrong when others played them suddenly made perfect sense. They fit together like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The girl's fingers moved in a pattern that seemed simple once you heard it. Obvious even, though it had eluded dozens of masters. She was playing a spiral. Each note related to the two that came before it, creating a mathematical sequence that curved and folded back on itself. It was like watching a flower bloom or a shell grow, following the natural patterns that existed everywhere in nature. The Fibonacci sequence, though the girl didn't know that's what it was called, she just knew it felt right. The music spiraled inward, getting tighter and more concentrated, building towards something. And then, just when it seemed like it couldn't get any more intense, the pattern completed itself. The final note hung in the air, perfect and pure, the answer to a question everyone had been asking all evening. The entire sequence had taken 3 seconds, just 3 seconds to play what had stumped the greatest pianist in the world. The girl lifted her hands from the keys and looked up at her stuffed rabbit sitting on top of the piano. She smiled at it, a small, private smile as if sharing a secret. Then she turned to look at the audience. The silence lasted for what felt like forever. People sat frozen, processing what they'd just witnessed. Had that really happened? Had a 7-year-old child just perfectly performed a piece that was supposed to be impossible? Then someone started clapping. Just one person at first, then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire hall erupted into applause. But this wasn't polite applause like what had followed the earlier performances. This was thunderous. People jumped to their feet, clapping and cheering. Some were shouting. Many were crying. The composer rushed forward, tears streaming down his face. He dropped to his knees beside the piano bench, not caring about his expensive suit or his dignity. He was laughing and crying at the same time, unable to form words. The girl looked at him with concern. "Did I do it wrong?" she asked quietly, worried by his tears. He shook his head violently, unable to speak. Finally, he managed to choke out, "How? How did you know?" The girl tilted her head, confused by the question. It seemed so obvious to her. She pointed to the sheet music, her small finger tracing a path through the notes. "It's the Fibonacci spiral," she said simply, as if explaining something basic. "See? Each note is related to the last 2 notes before it. When you follow the pattern, it curves back like a circle, like a shell at the beach, or like..." She reached up and grabbed her rabbit, showing him the embroidered ear. "Like this. See the spiral? My grandmother made it. It's the same pattern." The composer stared at the worn stuffed rabbit, at the simple spiral stitched into its ear. Then he looked back at his sheet music, seeing it with new eyes. He'd been so focused on creating something technically difficult, so caught up in complexity, that he'd buried the elegant mathematical beauty at the heart of the piece. He'd hidden the simple truth under layers of sophisticated notation. And this child, who saw the world through the lens of patterns and natural sequences, had recognized it instantly. She'd seen what trained musicians couldn't see because she wasn't trying to be clever or impressive. She was just following what felt natural. Other people were crowding onto the stage now. Musicians, judges, audience members, all wanting to see the girl who'd done the impossible. Her mother pushed through the crowd and scooped her daughter up into her arms, holding her tight. "I'm sorry, Mama," the girl said into her mother's shoulder. "I know you said not to touch anything." Her mother laughed through her tears. "It's okay, baby." "It's more than okay." The composer stood up, wiping his eyes. He looked at the crowd gathering around this remarkable child and her worn stuffed rabbit. People were asking her questions all at once. Where did you learn to play? Who is your teacher? How long have you been studying? The girl looked overwhelmed by all the attention. She buried her face in her mother's neck, suddenly shy. The composer raised his hands, asking for quiet. When the crowd settled down, he looked at the girl and her mother. What's your name? He asked gently. The mother told him, and then asked nervously, Is she in trouble? I didn't know she was going to do that. She's never even had a piano lesson. In trouble? The composer laughed, a genuine, joyful sound. No, not in trouble. Never in trouble. He looked around at all the faces, watching them. This child just accomplished something that our greatest musicians could not. She solved a puzzle I was beginning to think had no solution. And she did it by seeing something pure and simple that the rest of us had made too complicated. He turned back to the girl, who was peeking at him from her mother's shoulder. Thank you, he said softly. Thank you for reminding me what music is supposed to be. The girl smiled shyly and hugged her rabbit closer. She didn't fully understand what all the fuss was about. She just played what she heard in her head. Just followed the pattern. It had been easy, really. Beautiful, but easy. The applause started again, filling the hall with sound. And in that moment, with cameras flashing and people cheering, the girl just wanted to go home and tell her grandmother's rabbit that they'd done something special together. Something she didn't quite understand yet, but knew was important. The video appeared online within an hour. Someone in the audience had recorded the entire performance on their phone and posted it with a simple caption. 7-year-old solves impossible piano piece in 3 seconds. By morning, it had been viewed 1 million times. By the end of the week, that number had grown to 50 million. News outlets around the world picked up the story. Television programs showed clips of the girl's small figure at the massive piano, her feet dangling, her stuffed rabbit perched on top of the instrument like a guardian. The girl's mother had to disconnect their home phone because it wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters knocked on their apartment door at all hours. Music schools from 3 different continents sent letters offering full scholarships. A famous concert hall in Vienna wanted the girl to perform. A documentary filmmaker wanted to follow her life. A toy company wanted to create a doll based on her and her rabbit. It was overwhelming and more than a little frightening. The girl herself didn't understand what all the fuss was about. She'd just played a song. She'd followed a pattern that seemed obvious to her. Why was everyone acting like she'd done something impossible? In her mind, the impossible thing would have been to play it any other way. The pattern was right there, clear as daylight. How could she have done it differently? 3 days after the competition, the composer came to visit them. He arrived at their small apartment building in the evening, when the reporters had finally gone home for the day. The girl's mother was nervous, tidying their modest living room, apologizing for the cramped space and the worn furniture. The composer waved away her concerns. I grew up in a place smaller than this, he said kindly. Some of the best music in the world has been created in tiny rooms with peeling wallpaper and secondhand pianos. He sat down on their old couch and looked at the girl, who was sitting on the floor playing with her rabbit. She seemed so normal, so ordinary. Just a child playing quietly, not the prodigy who had stunned the world. I wanted to talk to you both, he said, about what happens next. The mother sat down looking worried. Is this about the schools? The offers? It's too much. I don't know what to do. I want what's best for her, but I'm afraid. I'm afraid of what all this attention might do to her. She's just a little girl. The composer nodded slowly. That's exactly why I came. I've seen what happens to children with gifts like hers. The world wants to consume them, to turn them into something for everyone else's benefit. Parents push them to perform, to compete, to be perfect, and often by the time those children grow up, they hate the very thing they once loved. He looked at the girl who was now listening to their conversation with interest. I don't want that to happen to you, he said directly to her. What you did that night was special. Not because you're a performing monkey who can do tricks, but because you saw something true and beautiful. You heard the music the way it was meant to be heard. The girl nodded slowly. I just heard the pattern, she said. It was pretty. Exactly, the composer said, smiling. It was pretty, not complicated, not impossible. Just pretty, and that's what music should be. He turned back to the mother. I'd like to help if you'll let me. Not to turn your daughter into a concert performer or a competition winner, but to nurture her gift in a way that keeps it joyful. Over the next several weeks, the composer became an unexpected friend to their family. He helped the mother navigate the flood of offers and opportunities. Together, they made careful choices. They selected a small, nurturing music school that focused on love of music rather than competition. They declined the television interviews and documentary offers. They said no to concert performances, at least for now. Let her be a child, the composer advised. Let her discover music at her own pace. If she wants to perform someday, wonderful. If she just wants to play for herself and her stuffed rabbit, that's wonderful too. The composer did one more thing. He went back to his studio and looked at all the music he'd written over the past decade. So much of it had been about showing off, about proving he was clever and sophisticated. He'd been so focused on impressing other musicians that he'd forgotten about touching hearts. He threw away the pieces that felt cold and technical. He started writing again, but differently this time. He thought about spirals and patterns, about the simple mathematical beauty that existed in nature. He wrote music that a child could understand, but that still had depth and meaning. His new composition was called Spiral Song. It was dedicated to the girl and her rabbit. When he published it, he included a note explaining what had happened that night at the competition. He wrote about how a 7-year-old had taught him the most important lesson of his career, that the best music doesn't come from making things complicated, but from recognizing the simple patterns that connect everything. The piece became one of his most beloved works. Piano teachers around the world used it to teach their students about the Fibonacci sequence and how mathematics and music intertwined. But more than that, it reminded people that music was meant to be felt, not just performed. The girl continued to see patterns everywhere. She still pointed out rhythms in rainfall and sequences in birdsongs. But now she also had a piano, a modest upright that the composer had helped her mother afford. She played it every day after school, not because anyone made her, but because she loved it. Sometimes she played the composer's new pieces. Sometimes she made up her own songs, following the patterns she heard in her head. Her stuffed rabbit always sat on top of the piano, watching with its one slightly torn ear, the spiral stitching visible to anyone who looked closely. Years later, when journalists asked the girl, now grown, about that night at the concert hall, she always said the same thing. I just played what I heard. Everyone was trying so hard to find a complicated answer that they missed the simple one. Sometimes the best solutions are the ones that feel natural, like water flowing or flowers growing. You don't have to force them, you just have to listen. The composer, now quite elderly, attended her first major concert as an adult. She'd chosen to perform eventually, but on her own terms, in her own time. She played a mixture of classical pieces and her own compositions, all of them reflecting her unique ability to hear the mathematical beauty in sound. At the end of the concert, she played Rhapsody in Fragments, the piece that had started it all. The audience held their breath during the final section, even though they knew she could do it. When the last note faded, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. The composer stood and applauded with everyone else, tears running down his weathered face. She'd reminded him all those years ago that music wasn't about being the best or the most technical or the most complicated. It was about truth and beauty and the patterns that connected all living things. After the concert, she found him backstage. She was carrying something wrapped in tissue paper. I wanted to give you this, she said, handing it to him. He unwrapped it carefully. Inside was her old stuffed rabbit, the one that had sat on the piano that night. The ear with the spiral stitching was more worn now, but still visible. I can't take this, he protested. This is yours. It's special, she smiled. That's exactly why you should have it. It helped me see the pattern that night. Maybe it will help you too. Keep making beautiful music. Keep it simple and true. He clutched the rabbit to his chest, unable to speak. In that moment, he understood that the greatest gift an artist could give was not a perfect performance or a complex composition, but the reminder that beauty existed everywhere, in the simplest things, if only we took the time to notice. The girl walked back to her dressing room, ready to greet the well-wishers and fans. But in her mind, she was still that 7-year-old in a faded dress, discovering for the first time that the patterns she heard in her head could become music that touched people's hearts. And the rabbit, now sitting on the composer's piano at home, continued its quiet watch, a reminder that sometimes the most profound solutions come not from complexity, but from seeing the world exactly as it is, a place of beautiful interconnected patterns. waiting for those brave enough to follow them wherever they might lead.